Hi everyone, I'm Nikunj, co-founder and CEO at True Foundry, and I welcome you to yet another exciting episode of True ML Talks. And today we have a very special guest, Labhesh Patel, who has held multiple leadership positions both in engineering and science roles in the past with leading organizations. His latest gig being the CTO and chief scientist. He used to be a CTO and chief scientist at a company called Jumio Corporation, which is world's leading provider of identity verification. There is so much to Labesh's experience that it's really hard for me to articulate that. So Labesh, I would love for you to introduce some of the key elements of your work life and maybe like anything from your personal life that you want to share. People would love to hear about that.
Thanks for that, Nikunj. So yeah, as you mentioned, my last gig was at Jumio in a major leadership role. Now I'm doing something which is in stealth mode on the generative AI side. And at Jumio, we had I mean, Jumio is still the leading provider of KYC and KYC services across and enabled services across the world. One of the things that was very interesting out there is taking the team, the wider junior team, from being more of a manual process where IDs were being verified by humans to an automated process using machine learning and AI. And that pivot was obviously very good from a enterprise value perspective, from a customer value perspective, what we were able to do from a scalability and accuracy side of the story. That was a major achievement by the team out there. And before Jumio, I was the chief scientist at a company called Epsuba, where we had built out this natural language processing platform and it was more of a platform that services where we were looking at how to get enterprises to very quickly start working on their cognitive journey. So there was a slew of open source projects, and at that time it was really hard for companies to just figure out where to go. And so that platform really helped with just enrolling enterprises into their machine learning journeys. So yeah, for the past decade and a half, my work mostly has been focused on machine learning and AI and how to bring these models to production. So it's not just about creating models, because there is a lot of work that goes on in science labs across the world. But from an enterprise perspective, the true value comes when you actually put the model in production and derive business value out of it. So that's been a major focus of mine for at least for the last decade and a half.
So 100% agreed with that. Model is of no use if you're not actually deriving business value out of it. Well, maybe in some cases research, yes, but primarily. And on
Yeah.
that note, given you have been operating in the machine learning world for a long time, and many of your engineering work also, from what I see, has resulted in patents and a lot of your research papers, probably hundreds of them at this point, if I'm not wrong. Uh,
Yeah, something like I have around 280 patents. So yeah, it's a reasonably large number.
Wow, that's a massive number. So I would love to hear a little bit about some of your maybe your favorite recent research papers or patents where you think it would be good for people to learn from. I think I would love to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So there were, so as you know, like a lot of the LLM, pretty much all LLMs, all everything in generative AI, which is generative AI is not just LLMs, right? So,
Right.
but when we talk about LLMs, a lot of it is based on that paper, a seminal paper, which was attention is what you need, right?
Right.
And that introduced the transformer network, which was the encoder decoder, and the unique novelty about it was a self-attention mechanism, which were where when you're trying to encode or decode at any given point at any time step, you are doing this vector multiplication. You're calculating the self attention of each token corresponding to every other token. So as soon as I say that, like the engineers would be like, okay, well, that is an n square calculation, and that was always the problem. That computationally, something like this was not feasible before a lot of the powerful GPUs came in. But attention was there. So one of the papers that we had was on visual question answering, where one before and this was around 2018 timeframe. Before that, what was happening is when you're trying to answer questions regarding a certain image, the problem was how do you get the model to attend to the right area of the image which has the answer. And there was always an issue regarding that. So we had come up with a method where we were using segmentation maps from a fully convolution network, and we were using these attention maps to get to a certain point on the image, and that was the novelty of the paper, and that really increased the state of the art at that time. But then, as time moved on, obviously, a lot of that work has now been superseded by the self-attention mechanisms that are prevalent today. And if somebody is going to be doing research on that area, I would highly recommend to focus on trying to figure out some of the computational aspects of self-attention, the n square that I'm talking about, and now they have flash attention, and there's a huge area of research which makes this more feasible, and that's where a lot of the ML folks are focusing on. So that was interesting. There was another was CycleGen, where we had a publication around, and this was more on a NLP side. The idea was, how do you produce, so even if a user wants to write a review, but sometimes, or a product review, sometimes it's hard for them to kind of just sit down and write it. So you can think of this as like it supersedes ChatGPT and LLMs. But the whole idea was, if the user knows that, okay, well, this is the review I want to give, like the rating, let's say 5, and I have produced some reviews before, then the system would take those reviews, look at the product characteristics and the review that the person is wanting to provide, and come up with a summary text. So kind of what we do with ChatGPT nowadays, but this was based on some of the NLP techniques out there. So on the patent side, one of the interesting things was when I was at Cisco, and when I was starting to file patents, the way this happened was, this was in the beginning of the voice over IP revolution, where like earlier everything was on like analog lines, and not that far out, but we are talking about mobile phones and stuff. But from an enterprise perspective, the voice over IP was still pretty new. And there was this problem around how to make the voice quality better, and this was just a bug that was filed in the bug database, and I resolved it by coming up with a new protocol. So I mean, like, okay, well, have a buffer here, have a buffer there, let there be a negotiation between the two sides, and do that. And when I did that, I got a call from the legal department a few weeks later that, well, what you did is something which is patentable. And in my mind, I was like, okay, well, you have to invent a light bulb or something for something to be patentable. So, but they are like, no, well, this protocol doesn't exist, and this is patentable. So we ended up, and the philosophy out there was more defensive, because at that time, Cisco was getting sued every other day for encroaching on somebody's patent, and it was like most of these were very frivolous, and Cisco wanted to build up a solid patent portfolio so that they can fight back with those. So that was something which was very interesting. That was my very first, and that got me started into kind of thinking from a perspective of innovation as we are trying to build product features. What is it that you are doing which is innovative, which can be defensible, and which can increase the enterprise value of the company? So that was my journey out there.
Very interesting. Such, like I resonate with it so much because I always have a hard time trying to figure out what part of the software that you're writing is patentable versus not. Like it's really hard to wrap your head around that. I also have that light bulb kind of a
Right.
mindset of patents, to be
Right.
honest.
Yeah, and honestly, my philosophy around patents is I mean it's defensive, right? I would hate it if a patent that I filed or got approved were used in an offensive way, right? But it's the one of the most important things to think about when you're thinking of patenting, whether it's within the context of your company, let's say True Foundry, is the idea detect if somebody infringes on that idea, can you detect it easily? If you cannot detect it easily, then it's a very big problem, because then you just because by definition, when you're writing a patent, you're giving up the idea, you're giving the whole detail of the idea, so somebody can copy it very easily, right? That's the
Right.
whole idea of a patent, right? So if somebody can copy it and you cannot detect it, then it's not a good situation to be in. And so
Hmm.
when you're coming up with an idea, you have to know that this can be detected. If somebody infringes, if my competitor infringes, I need to be able to detect that infringement. And that's a very big thing that a lot of people miss. And then when they file patents, then somebody else copies it because they just gave up their proprietary knowledge, and now you can't even detect it. So that's a very interesting way of just asking yourself whether or not this is patentable. And the most powerful patents are the simple ones where it's real. Like Amazon famously had this one-click checkout patent, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
very easily detectable if somebody infringes it. Amazon, I don't think, has ever gone out and
Yeah.
sued anybody for it. But it's if somebody infringes it, very easily detectable.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much. And actually, when you're describing your segmentation work, segmented guided attention networks work, there was one question that you mentioned asking questions on the different parts of the images. What type of questions were these?
So we are talking about, so there is a VQA 7W data set, and it can be like, let's say there is a image of a traffic light and the road, right? And the question can be how many cars are there in the image, or what is the color of the traffic light,
I
right?
see.
So when I ask that question, what is the color of the traffic light, this needs to be translated into that area of the image which has the traffic lights, and that's where the attention mechanism is.
Wow.
And now at that time we were using LSTMs. So LSTMs is like you go time step by time step, and they have a lot of issues. Well, in retrospect, everything has a lot of issues now that we
Yes.
have this this n square way of doing
Exactly.
things.
Yeah.
But LSTMs have the vanishing gradient issue, where since each time step depends on a lot of time steps, the error propagation kind of diminishes a lot by the time you're trying to really reason through it. And they are slower because everything is sequential and whatnot. But that's what we had. That was the state of the art at that time
Right.
from an infrastructure perspective, from a model infrastructure perspective.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense. Okay, very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I would love to switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about your stint at Jumio as well. Right, that's where you have spent a lot of time and most
Mhm.
recently as well. So, and especially given that Jumio operates in the identity verification space, and you kind of transformed the company from this manual verification to AI/ML driven verification. Tell us a little bit about what are these types of models? What was the impact of AI? How did you go about that transformation, building the team, building the first few models? Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I didn't transform anything. It was the team, right? I was probably just the conductor in the orchestra. But the whole idea was first you have to look at any given situation, right? The primary question needs to be which is what is the business impact? What is the business use case we are talking about, right? So, and what is the problem we are trying to solve? So, if the problem is that okay, well, we have humans who are doing this, and we need to automate it, there are questions that you need to ask, which is why do we want to automate it? If humans are doing it, and this is a rhetorical question, but what you want to be able to do is be very scalable. If the volume doubles, I don't want to spend 6 months hiring twice the number of people. Especially if you have a few thousand people, you don't want to hire a few thousand more people, and it will take time and whatnot. And there is cost to it. And from a customer perspective, obviously humans are slower than machines for a lot of the repetitive tasks. So you have these use cases that you need to figure out that okay, well, this is why we want to do this. And then the next question is, do you have the data? And a lot of the next question is supervised versus unsupervised. And if the problem lends itself to supervised training, then you have to ask yourself, do we have data, right? And this is where an important distinction comes, because I believe 90% of the work from a machine learning pipeline side is the data part of the story. The data management, collection of the data, making sure that you are constantly improving the quality of the data and whatnot, right? So if enterprise is just starting on their journey from an AI perspective, there is an expectation, usually an expectation mismatch between what AI can actually do and what people think it can do. And it's a very interesting mismatch, because sometimes what happens is a lot of the things that are easy for AI, people overestimate their complexity. People think that they are going to be harder. And a lot of the things which are really, really hard for AI, people just assume that they are going to be super easy. I mean, if I can do it in a second, why can't AI do this in a millisecond, right?
Right.
And that expectation management is also very important. The other thing is people's understanding of matrix, right? When I say that, oh, this is 99% accurate, our bias is to think that this is excellent. 99% sounds like a really good deal, right? But if you're looking at character error rate, right? So if there's an OCR system that you're building and you're trying to read characters, a 99% error, a 99% accuracy means that if the text has 100 characters, at an average, basically every single card or every single piece of text that you're reading has an error.
Right.
And when you put it in that way, people are like, no, that's not good. We don't want that. We don't want every card to have an error, right? But they were just happy about the 99%. And this gets complex very quickly, because when you're looking at fraud finding, when we are looking at like the basic use case of what let's say companies like Jumio do is take an ID and figure out whether or not that ID is authentic and extract the data out of it. You have to figure out whether it's fraudulent or not. And the industry standards, again, public numbers, are that it's 1 to 2% of the IDs that come into the system are fraudulent. So
Right.
there's a huge data imbalance, right? If I just pass every ID and say that everything is good, then I'm already 99% accurate, because by definition, but then your recall is zero. And now to understand precision and recall, now you need to understand precision, recall, a false acceptance rate, FRR, and a lot of these numbers put together is the quality. And each one of them will not be enough, right?
Right.
So first, I think the very first thing that needs to happen, even before anything, is getting the folks within enterprise at a reasonable level of understanding of what this whole thing means, right? Instead of talking about like individual cases, you need to now start talking about statistics and whatnot. And then what is usually a very good idea is start with one use case. One use case, one model where there is enough pain that people are facing. And get the right team together to solve that one little use case, because a lot of the work, especially in an enterprise at a larger, if you have several hundred people, is that expectation management, getting everybody to the same level. And if you suddenly come in and you're like, okay, well, everything is going to be AI tomorrow, it's not going to work. You have to start with one very specific use case. And with that use case, you have to prove out the pipeline, the entire pipeline, which is we are talking about collection of the data, tagging the data, making sure that the tags, the quality of the data is optimal, getting the compliance things out of the way, because just because your enterprise has some data doesn't mean you have the right to use that data in machine learning, and you have to have the right consent. I have a whole conference talk in Berlin, and it's on YouTube, where it's GDPR, comma AI. If you just type that and my name, you get the talk, which is how you do machine learning by segregating different data silos, because you need the right consent. So all that needs to be done. And a lot of this stuff is not something that you can just do later. It's like without that, you cannot even use one piece of data, because it doesn't belong to you, and then you're not going to be in non-compliance. And once that happens, you are going to be talking about creating feature engineering, getting the actual models, experimentation, making sure that you have the right BI reports to actually see the use of, see the impact of what you actually did, and then iterate. And this entire thing needs to be proved out with one very specific use case, which now needs to be which now needs to be articulated with everybody within the organization, and then you start building this up. And I think this is a place where it's super important to initially go be very careful, because you'll very quickly realize that we need more expertise within the team, not just from the machine learning, model writing, ML engineers perspective, but from a data, the right product people who understand this new vagueness that comes up with statistics. And then you start doing the second, third, fourth model, and keep on moving forward. So
Hmm.
that is probably my biggest recommendation from how to get started at this journey.
You covered some very interesting points around setting up metrics, educating people, thinking about compliance, like especially in in cases where like the data by default does not belong to the organization, right?
Yep.
So these are some very interesting challenges. Now you also talked about how like the data pipeline itself has like 90% of the challenges when working with ML problems. Um, Tell us a little bit more about how did you go about setting up the pipeline, because of course there's so much more beyond the actual modeling. In this case, I
Mhm.
assume that even the modeling initially might have been difficult if you're talking a
Mhm.
few years ago and like talking about this multimodal interfaces and stuff like that, right?
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about maybe like two things, like how did you think about the team that was building the model versus like like let's say how things would go to production, and how do you think
Mhm.
about the infrastructure layer that powered this entire thing, right? Would love to
Mhm.
hear your
Yeah,
thoughts on
yeah,
that.
yeah. No, absolutely. And what so Jumio is an AWS shop, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of the pipeline that we ended up using was the ML pipelines that are as part of the AWS SageMaker and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
This is so what ends up happening, and this is something that I have seen multiple times, and not just at Jumio, in my basically journey across various companies, is there are a lot of platforms that or point solutions that come in where within the pipeline, right? So when you think about the machine learning pipeline of data management, where does the data actually reside? And then how do you do feature engineering? What does the feature store look like, right? You have systems from like Uber, like Horowat. There is open source systems that people can use, And and not just at Jumio, at with various companies I've been at, we have experimented with a lot of those. And what I have found is one of the one of the things that helped us a lot is initially just going with whatever our cloud provider was providing, just initially, right? And
Hmm.
just getting things going, because it has the advantages of number one, when you think of a company at a certain level, there are every new vendor that comes in, there is a whole vendor management cycle that you need to go through. Now that vendor needs to have the ISO compliance and the PCI DSS compliance and whatnot. And by the time you go through the legal part, now comes finance. It's a completely different line item on the finance side, so you have to worry about that. When you work within the same cloud provider, a lot of those things are already taken care of, right? So when you look at from a SageMaker side, the SageMaker Studio offering that AWS had, that was something that we started using. But what you find very quickly is sometimes the cloud providers don't move as fast as some of the other startups do, right? And or some of the open source projects do. And there you need to really start looking at some of the, and once you start hitting those boundaries is when you start having some of the other conversations around what else can we use. And then ML Flow is one very good platform, the open source that we were looking at. But in general, the philosophy was if we can stick with what the cloud provider is providing, it seemed to us that it was the fastest way to get to a certain level. And then the second level of refinement is where you would start getting some of the other open source projects or vendors in to solve for those real point solutions. As far as one of the biggest issues that pretty much all companies at scale have is, as I said, is data and the data quality. And a lot of these providers don't do much about data quality. That is something that you have to create systems around that. So we were looking for, and I think this is previous to Jumio, we were looking at how to come up with solutions around just providing that as a service for enterprises, where you can constantly clean up the data that they have in an automated way. But yeah, the mindset usually was, how do you use what you have very quickly to get to a certain level, get to the limits of whatever your cloud provider is providing, and sometimes you would hit that limit very very quickly, and then go outside and solve that.
Got it. Makes sense. And how about the team? Like, how did you think about the organization of the team building the model and kind of deploying, maintaining the model, etc.?
Yeah. So one very important thing is, and this is something, if somebody is in that role, my strongest advice is to put everybody together, right? Don't have this mindset that somebody is building the model and then somebody and handing it over to somebody else. No. So the teams that work, and I have seen many team topologies before, but the teams that really work are teams where there is a very specific goal, a business goal. Let's say if you are talking about ID verification, and one of the business goals is reducing fraud, right? So there's a fraud team. Now that fraud team, all the resources that are needed, I'm talking about from the level of the product manager, product owners, the data engineers, the DevOps folks, security folks, compliance, security and compliance usually went hand in hand. The backend folks, the machine learning engineers, QA, and even the customer support person used to attend the meetings. Everybody needs to be part of the same team. And now you are given the guidance that we need to solve this, and there are very specific metrics that are there that they need to improve on, right? I don't think machine learning working in silo, handing stuff over to somebody else to deploy and then test and whatnot. I honestly don't think that's a very good approach. Put everybody within the same agile team. So if you're using agile or Scrum or some form of agile Scrum or Kanban or whatever, this 8 to 10 person team needs to be one team with one North Star of solving a certain problem, and that's basically how we do it.
How did you solve for the skill gap in that case? Was this baked into your hiring somehow, or did you build out some kind of tooling, guardrails where because a lot of time people who are doing like especially solving researchy problems on machine learning are not always like familiar with the entire like software engineering principles, CI/CD pipelines, tests, monitoring, all of that, right? So how did you solve
Right.
for that?
Yeah. So these are different people, right? So the machine learning folks who are coming in. So we had a core group of folks who were really good at like modeling. Like you give them,
Yeah.
they were kind of the customers for some of the things that the data engineers and the data platform people were
Okay.
producing, right? And so these guys will be working on that, right? That's exactly what they will be working on. But the interfaces, like now, let's say if somebody comes up with a state of the art model, and they're like, okay, well, this model is on the leaderboard, and this is giving us 1% extra whatever benefit. But if the feature engineering behind that and the DevOps behind that model and to get everything going is just so huge, there's going to be an internal pushback right then and there within the team, rather than this person coming up with that model and then throwing it to somebody else to kind of deploy it. So within the team, they would know that okay, well, this model might be a person, 1% better in research because they are working on a fixed data set. But in our cases, we have infinite data. We have like tons of data coming in on a daily basis. We don't have that limitation, so we can take a simpler model and which is much easier to deploy and maintain and kind of iterate on and keep fresh. That approach would be much better than taking a state of the art, which is really hard to maintain because of the other requirements, right? And that conversation, since they are part of the same team, happens. They don't have the same capability. So, like the data engineer will have a very different set of like their background is different, but they are part of the same team, right? So
Right.
the machine learning engineers would be talking to these guys on their daily stand-ups and stuff. So it's not the same people. It's
I see.
it's not the same skills. It's different skills, but they are part of the same team, right? And
Got it.
these are more feature and product focused teams where they all get together to figure out how to do that. And the fact that they have different skills actually helps in moving this forward.
Very
So
interesting.
when you're hiring the data folks, you're going, that's a very different job spec than when you're hiring those PhDs in machine learning.
Very interesting. So you basically solved by in this model you solve for the this is somebody else's problem kind of a setup basically.
Exactly. Exactly. You do not want to have things over the fence, and
Yeah.
and this is where, from a executive leadership perspective, these are the kind of things we are managing on a day-to-day basis. I'm super technical. I write code. Like right before this interview, I was actually cracking out code on something that I'm working on. But when you're trying to lead a team, it's those are the kind of things that you're looking for. Is how do you magnify the output of a team? That's your only role as a leader, is how do you magnify their output? And by
Yeah.
looking for these things and solving for that is basically how you get the advantage.
Such a good point. And one other question, I think you talked about how like it's the right thing to do to start with whatever like your cloud provider is providing you, getting something up and running, and when you hit the roadblocks, then like figuring out the alternate solutions, right?
Yeah.
So along these lines, tell us a little bit about what are some of these like examples of the roadblocks that maybe you kind of ran into, and how did you solve for those challenges maybe? Um,
Yeah. And one of the things that we ran into is because of some of these cloud providers being very secretive and they're wanting to release stuff at at certain points when their conferences are and stuff like that. You are struggling with certain items. In one case, we were the depending on your exact use case, if you're looking at anything which is super regulated, part of the challenge is that getting access to that data is not like a no-brainer. And if somebody watches my YouTube thing, it's like just getting access to an image that a machine learning engineer can train on, that requires a ton of things before, like auditing and governance, and they have to be in specific rooms where there are no windows, there are cameras looking at them so that they cannot take pictures, the phones are not allowed, blah blah blah. And then tracking of that those are the only images that were trained on and whatnot. And a lot of, once you get to that draconian level of compliance, and by the way, anybody who is trying to do things right with GDPR and CCPA and some of these compliances need to do a lot of this, especially where there is a lot of PII involved.
Hmm.
And cloud providers, by definition, I mean, they are not solving for some of these things, right? They are. What ends up happening is they are like, okay, well, this is we are ISO 27001 compliant, and then there's this shared security model where this side is responsible for some things, the other side is responsible for some things, and then when you start hitting those issues around this very specific ways of data access and whatnot, then you're like, okay, well, we don't really have a solution now, especially if you're trying to store feature stores, and feature stores might have some PII. Now, the access to that, and what the system is not providing a lot of the tools to just very quickly audit what is happening. The governance and audit layer is sometimes missing. So for once you start getting to that level, it was we were like, okay, well, we need to start looking at taking something which is either looking at another vendor or taking a look at something which is open source and see what we can do to kind of add to that, and add those elements ourselves. And from what I remember, that those are some of the areas where we started hitting what these guys were providing very quickly, very quickly.
I see. Very interesting. And did you have to eventually build out something in house, or were you actually able to kind of get some solutions outside? If it's shareable, yeah.
Yeah. And no, so I cannot really tell you exactly what we did,
Yeah.
but what happened is, again, going back to that some of these solutions might have been under wraps, and people were building them out, but they would not share till the end of the year and whatnot. And some of the things that we were kind of waiting for and trying to build ourselves just became publicly available downstream. So, and I remember being pretty mad about one particular item, and I actually sent a video to our rep at the cloud provider, and she sent it to the CEO of the company. We are talking about like a top five company. My talking about the fact that they should have shared this with us, and then they came back to us and said that, okay, from moving forward, any of our plans are going to be shared with you guys, and you guys are now going to be part of the private betas and whatnot, so that you guys are fully aware of what's coming for the next 2 years, and that helped quite a bit.
Wow, nice. Awesome. That's a very good story. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and talk. You mentioned that you are working something in generative AI. Seems like, and of course, anybody who works in technology is tracking the field closely. So, and I'm assuming you are as well. So, either in the context of Jumio and the fraud detection, identity verification, are you seeing any impact of generative AI already being reaped, or are you seeing some of the other directions where I guess maybe we should start with the Jumio bit, in the fraud detection bit and all. Are there do you see people utilizing generative AI already in that domain? And then,
So I cannot comment on what's happening at Jumio, but when you think of the whole fraud detection
yeah,
space and generative AI, right? This is a huge threat vector for the whole fraud detection space. For
right,
when you think about IDs and when you think about KYC, right? It's like it's so easy now to generate really high quality images,
right,
and it's if your main mode of figuring out whether or not a person is authentic is to look at an image of an ID, that can be very easily tracked now, where it can be very easily generated
right.
using LLMs and whatnot. Especially some of the multimodal LLMs that are now coming out, they will do a pretty good job at generating those, especially if they start training them on some of these data sources. So there's a huge threat vector for the whole industry that a lot of stuff that's coming their way is going to be synthetic, and we'll have to use AI to fight AI. And this is something that needs to happen. It's always a game of one. The game is where the fraudsters are trying to use AI to beat the systems, and the system providers are using AI to try to prevent this from happening. So this is going to definitely completely require the identity proofing providers to rethink how to do things. Again, there are solutions in place. There are potential solutions in place where there are certain things that you can do around looking at not just the image of the ID, but corroborating those elements that you are looking at with government sources and stuff. And again, this is something that a lot of the identity providers do, where it's hard to get that part. You can generate an ID, but to get every single item as somebody else's ID, unless you have stolen their ID, is not going to be possible.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And then you also want to make sure that you are detecting the liveness of the person, right? So when you look at the ID, one of the things that pretty much all KYC providers do is match your selfie and with the picture on the ID. And while taking the selfie, you do what is called a liveness test. So that liveness test also uses AI, and there is a huge amount of research that's happening is how to fake it,
Right.
and then there's a huge amount of research that's happening how to detect deepfakes or from a liveness perspective.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a cat and mouse game going on both sides, and I think whether it be the good actors or those fraudsters, both are going to be working on this for a pretty long period of time. I don't think there is going to be a solution where it's like, okay, well, this works 100% of the time, but it's going to be a very active area of research for the next few years.
Makes sense. And which part of generative AI, what aspect of generative AI is like the most exciting for you right now? Because you mentioned you are working on something in generative AI you were doing right before this. So love to hear.
Yeah. So when I look at some of the problems, and as I talk to various CTOs and just executive leaders across enterprises, currently my feeling is, and I think it's going to change in Q1, Q2. A lot of companies are doing POCs. They are doing POCs with LLMs, and they are trying to get stuff out. And the kind of issues that LLMs have are actually very interesting. There's a huge amount of innovation that is already there, but huge potential already still to be worked on. Hallucinations, for example, right?
Right.
If you that concept doesn't exist in a lot of the other ways that we were doing things, right?
Right.
So hallucinations is something that a lot of companies are currently suffering from, especially in their POCs and whatnot. That's one. Number two is I personally feel that the future is going to be SLMs and not LLMs for enterprises, so small language models.
Hmm.
And the reason is this: when you look at how technology progressed in the early 2000s and whatnot, we had these vertical servers, right? So you used to have like big Solaris servers, and the when you were trying to do a huge amount of compute, you would increase those vertically. And then what happened was Google came around and changed the paradigm with MapReduce. Now you started having thousands of these servers, which were commodity servers, and they increased the fault tolerance, increased the scalability of the system, lowered the cost dramatically. I think that's because the maintenance of those the MapReduce clusters was much easier than trying to scale something vertically, which had a single point of failure. That's what we are going to start seeing with small language models. Having a 175 billion or whatever 1.7 trillion parameter model that OpenAI has, that's not going to be something that every enterprise or CIO is going to be able to stomach the cost for, especially because I don't want my model to understand Swahili. I want my model to just tell me the answers to the specific questions I'm asking.
Right.
And that constitutes a fraction of the model space compared to what like ChatGPT or GPT Turbo or the
Right.
new 1106 model comes up with. So you want a series of these models, each one of them trained and being able to reply to a certain department's query or certain questions regarding specific areas very well, and do that very quickly, because I don't have the time for this when I say I, users will not have the time for getting that inference from a large model, which the inference is
Right.
very slow. So you want smaller models, you want them queued, you want a router which directs the query to the right model, and that infrastructure is something that I feel is going to be the winning architecture as we move forward. People are still, and and myself also, when we are trying to build something out and we start throwing API calls to ChatGPT, half of the code is like trying to figure out when the rate limit is hit, what do we do? Because the rate limit gets hit very, very quickly.
Right.
And there's just not enough of compute power available to some of these folks to be able to really get to the enterprise use cases. So you will need to get some of the questions answered using the Mistrals of the world, the 7 billion model, 7 billion parameter model, which can do it very quickly on a laptop. And then something quality metric, the quality is not good, you maybe go to a larger language model, but that should happen only a fraction of the time. And these kind of things are coming up right now. We are in the hype phase, and for the right reasons. I mean, this technology is magical, but when you start putting things in production, is when people will realize that there are a lot of these issues which are solved in other areas that they are working on, but not with LLMs currently.
I see. Like this topic that you've touched on, Labesh, is obviously very close to my heart. Like we are actively working on solving some of these problems as well.
Mhm.
So, and I also think a lot about this topic that you just touched on, right? I have a follow up question for you. Now, one of the magic that I guess GPT-4 or any of the very large language models bring with them is the simplicity, and almost like you could brainlessly throw every task at GPT-4 and likely
Mhm.
it's going to do a pretty good job at that.
Sure.
So as a developer you don't have to think much about that, right? Like
Mhm. Mhm.
like if you're for a single thing, we're making like six GPT-4 calls, yes, it's going to take time to respond,
Yep.
but some people are betting that OpenAI or any of these, like whatever, like Bard or something, like people are
Mhm.
going to improve the model's efficiency, the
Yep.
latency is going to go down,
Mhm.
the hopefully, like with the advances in hardware, the cost is going to go down, right? So Like that's another parallel direction where some people think about the world might be moving in, because it
Mhm.
provides you a level of simplicity that is unprecedented almost, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
The world were to move in the direction that you just described, which, by the way, I also adhere to that school of thought. I actually
Mhm.
also that's exactly what. But I sometimes struggle to figure out how or when would that transition happen, and why would the transition happen? What's going to be the trigger here?
Trigger the transition to what
Like
exactly? The
very small,
small
very
models.
large number of models, as opposed to
Uh-huh.
very small but very large models, like which is the default today. But yeah,
Right, right. So when you really think about it, the use cases will be very different for different personas, right? When you're
right.
thinking of an enterprise, right, it's a very different thought process than when I'm trying to plan a vacation in Europe, right? So myself, if I'm the CTO somewhere and I'm thinking about what to bring in my enterprise, is a very different thought process than if I'm going to Europe. The creativity, the fact that I'm very okay with hallucinations in this part of the world when I'm planning a vacation is very different to what I'm okay with in the context of an enterprise, and that's where the thing is. So even though they might inferences might get reduced, the time and cost, but we are going to hit a physical limit because these are large models, right? And the attention mechanism for decoding is also n squared, as we just said, in the n squared in the size of the context. So if you start having this larger context, then it's exponential. It's quadratic, not exponential. It's quadratic in the inference time is going to be quadratic. So on the one side, you want that 128,000 token, but on the other side, you'll pay the cost in the latency, and that's not something where hardware improvements are going to are going to make it right. So flash attention and some of these other techniques reduce that by doing some optimizations, but the orders are still the same. The complexity is still the same. So for the enterprise, you cannot have you model safety is super important, right? I cannot have as the CIO, I cannot have a model that starts giving people recommendation of the best ways to die if they ask for it, right? Because this is a specific example that happened with Mistral, with one of the models where somebody asked that question and very nicely gave a recipe for whatever, which was not something that you are going to be okay with within the context of an enterprise. So you will need to have the red teaming effort. You will need to make sure that the model safety is there. And all this work is dependent on the size of the model at some level. You cannot, the more powerful the model is, the more hallucination it can potentially have, and the more guardrails you'll have to put just from a cycles perspective. When if the only thing that the CFO wants is like, I need to ask this model to do my yearly audit and give me the numbers, it's a super overkill for a huge model, especially because of the safety and the bias and all that other stuff that comes with the larger models, right? So for enterprises, the mindset is very different. For the folks who are working for the rest of the world, for the users, where the use cases are immense, it's absolutely magical. Where what you can do with LLMs. For enterprises, also there are certain things that if you constrain it, and there are ways of constraining it using retrieval augmented generation and whatnot, so that the model only answers within the context of what it retrieves from its vector database index, then it's fine. But in general, the cost, the safety, the inference time, the availability of the required rate limits from the providers, all these are going to be pretty heavy on folks' mind as they start going into the actual implementation of this stuff.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts. Got to learn a lot about how you're thinking about generative AI LLM space. Maybe one last question. Before we call it a day today. So you have seen a lot of growth and development at Jumio, right? And you have seen a lot of transformations at Jumio yourself. If you think about your tenure as a CTO and chief scientist there, what are some one or two things that you are the most proud of in this journey? Yeah.
Yeah. So again, during my time there, I believe the thing that stands out the most is number one, is the team, right? The team is amazing. The company is doing phenomenally well. The pivot from doing things in a manual way
Hmm.
to bringing AI in production in a way that really improved the value prop to the customers was something that the team did incredibly well. And this is something that I could not be prouder of on part of the team. The way they accomplished that is amazing. So as far as the the next steps are concerned, right, from an ID verification perspective, everybody is staring at some of the threats that these
Right.
technologies are coming up with. But the team that is there right now is incredible, and I'm super positive that they're going to be winning over whatever fraudsters can bring.
Amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much, Labhesh, for taking the time and sharing the wealth of information that you have with us and the audience of our TrueML Talk series. Really appreciate you taking this time.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was a pleasure, Nikunj.